All right, welcome to another deep dive with us. You know how this works. We take a big stack of research and condense it down so you can get the key takeaways without having to wade through it all yourself. And today we're diving into 11th century Byzantium. Buckle up.
We are. And our guide for this journey is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on John Idyllos.
John Idyllos, he was, well, let's just get right to it. Who was he and what was he all about? Why should we care about this guy?
So John Idyllos was originally from Byzantine, Italy. And get this, he ended up becoming the head honcho, the top dog at the imperially sponsored School of Philosophy in Constantinople.
Okay, so right away we know this guy was no slouch. Constantinople, major hub of the Byzantine Empire, not a place where just anyone gets to lead the philosophical scene.
Exactly. And he didn't just stumble into this position, he actually succeeded another big name, Michael Psellos. The source material describes Idyllos as having a dialectical method and a combative temper. So basically, he loved a good debate and he wasn't afraid to challenge anyone.
Sounds like my kind of guy, honestly. A sharp mind, loves to argue, making waves in the intellectual circles of Byzantium. I can already picture the kind of lively discussions that must have been happening in his classroom.
Oh, definitely. He was a popular teacher. He had a diverse student body, not just folks from Constantinople, but from all over the Latin West, the Near East, even as far as the Caucasus. Clearly, he was a charismatic and influential figure.
And this all in the 11th century. That's crazy to think about. So we have this picture of him as this top philosopher, but it sounds like he wasn't just an ivory tower academic. He also had a hand in politics.
You're right. He wasn't just a thinker. He had connections in the political world, which actually led him to go on a diplomatic mission to the Normans in the 1070s.
Oh, wow. So from the classroom to the halls of power, that's a pretty interesting trajectory.
It is. But this is where things take a dramatic turn. He was accused of treason during this mission and had to flee to Rome. A philosopher turned fugitive.
Oh, man, what a story. So what happened next? Did he rot in exile or did he manage to get back in the game?
Thankfully for Idyllos, Emperor Michael VII eventually pardoned him and allowed him to come back to Constantinople. He returned around 1076, and that's when he really reached the pinnacle of his career. He took over from Psellos as the consul of the philosophers, basically the leading intellectual light in Constantinople.
Quite a comeback. But I'm guessing this is where things start to go downhill, because we know he was eventually condemned for heresy.
Yes, unfortunately. Even though there were whispers of unorthodox views earlier, initially he had the protection of the emperor. But the winds of change were blowing. A new emperor, Alexios I, came to power in 1081, and the political tides turned against Idyllos.
Ah, the fickle nature of power and patronage. So this new emperor, Alexios I, was not a fan of Idyllos. What led to this drastic shift? Was it purely political, or did Idyllos' ideas really rub people the wrong way?
It was probably a combination of factors, but Alexios I definitely didn't share the same fondness for Idyllos. This shift in power dynamics opened the door for his critics, and they didn't hesitate to pounce. A new trial was convened.
And this time around, no imperial favor to shield him.
Exactly. And the outcome was harsh. In March 1082, John Idyllos was condemned for heresy. The accusations against him really honed in on his dialectical method. Remember, that was his trademark approach to philosophical inquiry and his interest in Platonic teachings, which were seen as suspect by some within the church. This condemnation meant that he was essentially removed from public life, bringing his illustrious career to a rather abrupt end.
Wow, from the heights of philosophical stardom to being branded a heretic, it's almost Shakespearean.
It really is. And it's interesting how his legacy is still debated today. Some scholars view him as a genuine threat to Orthodox Christian thought, while others see him as a bold, free-thinking philosopher who simply dared to question the status quo. It all comes down to how one interprets the limited evidence we have.
So, was he a dangerous heretic? A victim of political machinations? Or maybe a little bit of both? A real intellectual mystery? But unfortunately, we can only go off of the writings that survived. It's such a shame that many of his works were probably destroyed after his condemnation. Imagine how much richer our understanding of his thought would be if we had access to all of his writings.
It really makes you wonder what was lost, doesn't it? The destruction of texts, particularly those deemed heretical, was sadly not uncommon in those times. It happened to Idyllos' own student, Eustratios of Nicaea as well. It's a reminder of how fragile intellectual legacies can be, especially when they challenge the prevailing power structures.
Absolutely. So we're left with these fragments, these glimpses into his mind. What works did survive, and what do they tell us about this enigmatic figure?
Well, his most important work, the one that gives us the most direct insights into his thinking, is a collection called the Questiones Quodlibetales, which translates roughly to questions on any subject.
Yeah.
Beyond that, we have some of his logical treatises like De Dialectica and De Syllogismus. We also have his commentaries on Aristotle's topics and Porphyry's Isagoge, a work on rhetoric called De Rhetorica, and some explanatory notes on the works of Pseudo-Dionysius. There's also an apologetic letter attributed to him, although scholars are still debating whether he actually wrote it.
It sounds like even figuring out which works are truly his is a challenge in itself.
Oh yeah, it's a bit of a scholarly puzzle. Take, for example, the synopsis on Porphyry. Some question if it's really his, but the writing style and the use of a specific Aristotelian example, the goat stag, which appears in other confirmed works by Idolos, suggest it might indeed be authentic.
Interesting. So it's like a detective story, piecing together clues from different texts to try to understand this guy. What about this De Rhetorica? I read that it's not really a straightforward summary of Aristotle's ideas on rhetoric.
You're right. Instead of directly summarizing Aristotle, it seems to be more like a compilation of different rhetorical theories and ideas from various sources that were floating around at the time. What's really interesting is that it doesn't even mention enthymemata, which are kind of central to Aristotelian rhetoric as a form of logical argument. This might suggest that Idolos didn't actually have access to Aristotle's original work on rhetoric, or maybe he just wasn't that familiar with it. Similarly, his commentary on Aristotle's Topics leans heavily on the interpretations of an earlier commentator, Alexander of Aphrodisias.
So it sounds like in these areas, at least, Idlos was more of a compiler and interpreter of existing ideas rather than a groundbreaking innovator.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment.
Yeah.
But remember, his role as a teacher was also hugely important. His logical treatises, especially De Dialectica, were basically introductions to Aristotelian logic, helping his students at the imperial court to learn the art of reasoning effectively, even when absolute proof was unavailable. He was giving them a fundamental toolkit for thinking critically and engaging in productive debate.
Got it. Now, back to the Questiones Quodlibetales. It's a bit strange that it wasn't even compiled by Idolos himself. How did that happen?
That's right. It's a collection of 93 chapters covering a wide range of topics: logic, epistemology, ethics, physics, you name it. Scholars think it was probably put together after his death, possibly from notes taken by his students, and maybe even including some works that weren't actually his. But despite this, most of the Questiones is considered genuine, and it gives us incredibly valuable insights into his teachings and the intellectual debates happening at the Byzantine court. For example, there's a question about Homer that came from the co-emperor Andronicos Ducas. Another one advises Emperor Michael VII on the soul's fate after death, and there's even one where he argues against the eternity of the world for Emperor Alexios I.
So it's a real mixed bag, but it captures the essence of his thought. Now, shifting gears a bit, the outline emphasizes this idea of Idolos acting as philosophers. What's that all about?
Well, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry points out that most of Idolos' surviving writings are didactic in nature. In other words, they were primarily intended for teaching his students. So they kind of assume that the reader already has a certain level of background knowledge about the philosophical ideas of the time, and they also reflect Idolos' own evolving views. This makes it really difficult for us, centuries later, to fully reconstruct his overall philosophical system. Imagine trying to understand the last lecture in a course without attending any of the previous ones.
That makes sense. You're only getting a partial view, not the full picture.
Exactly. That's why the questions are so valuable. They give us a more direct look at his thinking. But at the same time, we have to be careful about how we read the accounts of his critics, like Anakomnono and the official condemnation in the Synodicon. They might have had their own agendas and biases. Most scholars seem to agree that Idolos was trying to find a way to reconcile the wisdom of ancient Greek philosophy with the tenets of Christian faith. He was walking a tightrope between those who were really into incorporating classical thought and those who were more conservative and wanted to stick to traditional Christian doctrine.
So his whole acting as philosophers thing was about finding a way to make these two seemingly different worldviews work together. Let's dig deeper into some of his specific philosophical ideas, starting with logic. What were some of his key contributions in that area?
In logic, Idolos was really interested in understanding substances, the fundamental things that exist, and universals, which are general concepts that apply to lots of individual things, like humanity or beauty. Following in the footsteps of Michael Psellos, he believed that substances exist independently, but they ultimately owe their existence to God's creative power. And when it came to universals, He adopted what's called the Alexandrian tripartite view.
Okay, break that down for me. The Alexandrian what now?
Right, sorry. It sounds complicated, but it's actually pretty simple. The Alexandrian tripartite view basically says that universals exist in three ways. Ante res, meaning before things, as perfect archetypes in the mind of God. In rebus, meaning in things, as the shared essence that's present in all the particular instances of something. And post res, meaning after things, as abstract concepts that our minds form by observing similarities between things.
So let me get this straight. Even if I've never seen every kind of tree in the world, the universal concept of tree still exists in God's mind.
Exactly. The fact that we haven't encountered or categorized every single instance of something doesn't mean that the universal concept doesn't exist. Especially not in the mind of God, who knows and encompasses all things. Idlos also argued that these universals aren't physical things, they're incorporeal. They belong to a realm of pure being, existing either within particular things or within the intellect. His focus on universals shows just how important this topic was in the philosophical debates of his time, and it aligns him with a kind of middle ground position within the Alexandrian tradition, which tried to find a balance between extreme Platonism and nominalism.
All right, that's a lot to unpack, but I think I'm starting to get it. Moving on to cosmology, his ideas about the universe. The outline mentions his arguments against the eternity of the world. That was a pretty big deal back then, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, huge. Whether the universe had a beginning in time or it always existed was a massive question, especially for those trying to reconcile pagan philosophy with Christian beliefs. Idolos, drawing heavily from the 6th century Christian philosopher John Philoponus, tackled this head-on in his Questiones. He went up against some heavy hitters like Aristotle, Porphyry, and Proclus, all of whom had argued for an eternal universe.
So what was his strategy? How did he try to prove them wrong?
He had a two-pronged approach. First, he directly challenged the philosophical arguments of Aristotle and Proclus, saying that the universe must have been created by God's free will, not out of some kind of necessity in the divine nature. He was basically saying that God chose to create the universe. It wasn't an automatic process. He agreed with Philoponus that all material things are subject to decay and corruption, so the idea of an eternal and unchanging substance like the ether, which Aristotle believed made up the heavens, was simply illogical. In another part of the Questions, he even tries to find a way to connect Plato's idea of a fifth mathematical figure that represents the heavens with Aristotle's notion of the fifth element, the ether, maybe suggesting they were different ways of describing the same thing. But for Idolos, all matter at its core was indefinite, like a kind of non-being, and that's what causes things to change and decay.
So for Idolos, the universe had a definite starting point, and that starting point was God's act of creation. And what about the second part of his argument?
His second argument came straight from Christian theology. He said that believing in the end of the world and the final judgment is absolutely essential to Christian faith. If the world was eternal, there would be no final judgment, which would undermine the core belief and moral framework of Christianity.
Makes sense. He was grounding his views about the universe within the context of his Christian faith. So let's talk about ethics. What did Idolos have to say about how we should live our lives?
He had a really fascinating take on virtues. He basically divided them into different levels based on our capacity for reason. He said there are natural virtues, which even animals have, but these aren't really true virtues in the full sense. Then there are ethical virtues, which are unique to humans because they require the use of reason. And finally, there are higher spiritual virtues, which are necessary for achieving union with God.
So different levels of virtue, with the higher ones leading us closer to God. And he got some of these ideas from Aristotle, right?
Exactly. He borrowed a lot from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. He defined ethical virtues as a middle point between two extremes. Like courage, for example, is the ideal balance between recklessness and cowardice. He also really liked the 4 cardinal virtues: prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. He emphasized that these virtues aren't just natural inclinations or fleeting emotions, they're stable habits that we develop through the rational part of our soul.
So it's about using our reason to cultivate virtuous habits. And he also brought in Plato's ideas about the soul into his ethical framework.
He did. He used Plato's idea of the tripartite soul, reason, spirit, and appetite, and even used the famous chariot allegory from Plato's Phaedrus. Remember the one where reason is the charioteer trying to control the 2 horses of spirit and desire? He used this to illustrate how important reason is for achieving virtue. And what's really cool is that he then put all of this, the Aristotelian stuff, into the bigger context of the Neoplatonic hierarchy of virtues.
Hold on, Neoplatonic hierarchy of virtues? Okay, you're losing me a bit.
No worries, it's pretty straightforward. Basically, Neoplatonism is a philosophical system that developed from Plato's ideas, but it incorporated a lot of other influences too. And it has this idea of a ladder of reality with God or the one at the top and everything else emanating or flowing from that source. So Idalos is taking Aristotle's ethical virtues and saying they fit into this Neoplatonic framework as the first rung on the ladder. He's saying they're like the starting point, the foundation for a higher kind of virtue that ultimately leads us back to God.
Oh, okay, I see. So, like, living a morally good life, according to Aristotle's ideas, is the first step towards a more spiritual and mystical kind of virtue.
Exactly. It fits perfectly with the Neoplatonic view of humans as rational souls who are trying to return to their source, to the divine. Ethical virtues are crucial for our earthly existence, but they're just one part of a much bigger journey. Even his interpretation of Christ's teaching to turn the other cheek is influenced by Neoplatonism. He saw it as a call to rise above the duality and conflict of the material world, which he believed was a consequence of the fall.
Really interesting. So we see all these different philosophical threads weaving together in his ethics. What about his views on the soul itself?
The soul was central to Idalos' thought. He firmly believed in the soul's immortality, which of course was a core Christian belief. But his engagement with Plato led him down some less conventional paths. He actually questioned some of Plato's arguments for the soul's immortality.
Oh, wow. So he was willing to critique even the great Plato. What didn't he agree with?
Yeah, he wasn't afraid to challenge anyone, even the big names. He took issue with Plato's arguments that the soul is immortal because it's self-moving and the source of life. He thought that the soul's connection to the physical body suggested that it might be subject to corruption as well. He ended up aligning himself more with Aristotle, who believed that only the intellect, the rational part of the soul, was truly immortal and could survive the death of the body.
So for Idalos, it was our reason, our ability to think and understand that was the eternal part of ourselves. What did he think happened to the soul after death?
He was influenced by the Neoplatonist philosopher Proclus, who said that when the soul leaves the body, it enters a state of inactivity. This got him into some hot water, as people accused him of being a dead souler, meaning he believed the dead couldn't progress spiritually or even work miracles after death.
That's pretty controversial stuff.
It was. But Idalos did leave open the possibility that God's grace could overcome this inactivity and help the soul on its journey towards redemption. He also wrestled with the question of what happens to our identity after resurrection. He argued that identity is based on the form or essence of the soul, not on the ever-changing matter of the body. He even tackled the food chain argument, which was a popular objection to the idea of bodily resurrection. People were saying, well, if we eat animals and those animals eat other animals, then what happens to all those different bits of matter when we're resurrected? Who gets what? Idalos proposed a spiritual resurrection, where the soul's form is clothed in a new, perfect kind of matter. His overall view of the soul is very much in line with Christian Platonism, this idea that the soul is a rational entity striving to return to its original pure state, which was connected to God.
So basically, a lot of his ideas about the soul, especially its inactivity after death and the nature of resurrection, were likely seen as pushing the boundaries of acceptable Christian doctrine.
Definitely. Those were likely some of the key reasons he ended up being condemned.
Speaking of which, let's talk about his theology. How did all this philosophy stuff shape his views on God and the divine?
Well, Neoplatonism was a huge influence on his theology. The Neoplatonic concepts of a hierarchical chain of being everything ranked in order of importance and a series of causes and effects are all over his theological discussions. For example, when he's explaining solar eclipses and the questions, he talks about God as the ultimate cause and the moon as just a secondary cause, an instrument that God uses to carry out his plan. He even outlines the Neoplatonic doctrine of the three hypostases, the one, the intellect, and the soul, which represent different levels of reality flowing from the ultimate source. And get this, he identifies these hypostases with the Christian Trinity, the Father, the Son, who he connects with the intellect, and the Holy Spirit. He even quotes a passage from the Gospel of John to support this connection.
So he's making explicit links between this philosophical framework and Christian doctrine.
Yes, he is. Even though he sometimes presents these philosophical ideas as coming from the most insightful pagan theologians, when you look at the scriptural references he uses and his confession of faith, it seems pretty clear that he was developing his own unique theological synthesis. His confession even includes an adaptation of the Pseudo-Athanasian Creed, a Latin theological text. But he makes some subtle changes to it that some people saw as problematic, especially concerning how the three persons of the Trinity relate to each other. Some scholars argue that his language leans towards a form of tritheism, which is the belief in three separate gods, while others maintain that he was trying to stay within the bounds of Orthodox Trinitarian doctrine. It's a really tricky question, and scholars are still debating it today.
And there's also the whole issue of him using the term worship in relation to religious icons, right?
Yeah, that was another controversial one. He uses the Greek word latruin, which usually refers to the highest form of worship reserved for God in the context of icons of Christ. This really raised some eyebrows. Some scholars suggest he might have been drawing on a passage from the book of Hebrews, which talks about earthly religious practices being shadows of heavenly realities. Maybe he was trying to say that icons are earthly reflections of the divine, and true worship is directed towards the divine archetype that those icons represent. He also quotes a lot from John of Damascus, who was a big defender of icons. Maybe he was trying to show that he was in line with Orthodox icon theology.
It sounds like there's a lot of ambiguity in his writings, which makes it hard to pin down exactly what he believed.
That's true. His style is very concise. He uses a lot of dialectic, which means exploring different sides of an issue. And of course, we only have fragments of his work. And let's not forget that he was living in a time when expressing certain ideas could be dangerous, so he might have intentionally left some things open to interpretation.
Makes sense. So let's get back to his condemnation. The outline mentions two different synods that investigated his teachings, and then finally, he was condemned in 1082.
Right. He was actually acquitted in the first synod, which happened around 1076 or 1077, probably because he still had support from the imperial court at that point. But the second trial in 1082, under Emperor Alexios I, well, that's when things went south. We know about this trial not just from historians like Anna Komnenon, who wrote about it in her book called the Alexiad, but also from official documents. We actually have some of the trial records and the Synodicon of Orthodoxy, which is basically a list of people and teachings that were deemed heretical.
And the Synodicon laid out the specific charges against Idalos, right?
It did. It lists 10 charges, and some versions even add an 11th charge that directly condemns Idalos by name. These charges accuse him of all sorts of unorthodox views on things like the Trinity, creation, and the soul. While it's possible that these accusations oversimplified or even twisted his actual beliefs, they show us the official reasons why he was condemned.
And like we talked about earlier, scholars are still debating whether he was actually a heretic or just a philosopher pushing the boundaries of acceptable thought.
Right. Some people see him as a real threat to orthodoxy, someone who is consciously challenging core Christian beliefs. Others see him as more of a philosophical gadfly, someone who loved to debate and explore different ideas, but wasn't necessarily trying to undermine Christianity. It's interesting to think that maybe it wasn't so much his specific beliefs that got him into trouble, but his method, his commitment to questioning everything. Maybe that was seen as a threat to the authority of tradition.
It definitely feels like that classic conflict between intellectual freedom and religious dogma was a big part of his story. But you also mentioned the importance of the political context.
Absolutely. Almost all scholars agree that politics played a huge role in his condemnation. He was closely tied to the previous dynasty, which made him a target once Alexios I came to power. Anna Komnenon even claims that Idalos was trying to stir up rebellion among his students, but a lot of people think she was exaggerating or just making things up to make him look worse. And then there's the fact that he was of Latin origin. Alexios I might have wanted to make an example of him to appease anti-Latin sentiment. Plus, he was dealing with military setbacks, and blaming a controversial figure like Idalos could have been a way to distract people from those problems. There might have been personal rivalries within the philosophical school as well, and even his popularity and influence could have been seen as a threat to those in power. So yeah, politics were definitely tangled up in all of this.
It was much more than just an abstract philosophical debate. It sounds like there were a lot of different forces at work. The outline mentions something called the watershed event thesis. What's that about?
Some historians have argued that the condemnation of John Idalos was a turning point in Byzantine intellectual history. They say that it created a climate of fear that discouraged people from pursuing philosophy and science in any depth, leading to a kind of intellectual stagnation. It's kind of like the opposite of what some people say happened in the Latin West after the condemnations of 1277. There's a theory that those condemnations actually helped to pave the way for modern science by forcing people to think outside the box. But just like that theory is debated, the idea that Idalos' condemnation killed off Byzantine intellectual life is also complicated and needs more research.
Fascinating. So what happened to Idalos after he was condemned? Did he just disappear?
Pretty much. He vanishes from the historical record after 1082. But he didn't completely fade into obscurity. There's this satirical work from the 12th century called the Temerian, and it shows Idalos in the underworld, rejected by both the ancient Greek philosophers and the Christians of his own time. It shows that he was still remembered and maybe even mocked centuries later. But his works continue to be copied, and we have about 24 manuscripts of his writings today. Some of those manuscripts came from southern Italy, which suggests that there was still some interest in his ideas there. It wasn't until the 19th century that Russian and Georgian scholars rediscovered his writings, and he finally started to get some attention from Western scholars. People have focused a lot on what his trial tells us about the relationship between faith and reason, but we're still in the early stages of really understanding and evaluating his philosophical ideas.
John Idalos, a brilliant, controversial figure who tried to bring together the worlds of classical philosophy and Christian theology. A real cautionary tale about the dangers of intellectual ambition in a time of political and religious upheaval.
He really is a fascinating case study. It makes you think about the enduring tension between intellectual inquiry and established doctrine. Is it always going to be a battle between the two? Or can we find ways to make these different systems of thought work together to enrich our understanding of the world? Maybe exploring the works of the philosophers who influenced Idalos, Plato, Aristotle, the Neoplatonists could give us some clues.
That's something to think about.
It is.